Camping vacations on the weekend were usually a lot of fun for my girlfriend and myself. It was inevitable that we would discover new locations on or near the Appalachian Mountains, given that we used to live exactly inside the Appalachian region in Virginia. We were both incredibly stressed out from our weekday jobs, so spending time away from home and in nature on weekends was a lifesaver. We had camped in the Appalachians on dozens of occasions before this, but none of those had ever come to this kind of conclusion. We set out on a short, 3-mile path on a Saturday morning to reach a peaceful, secluded camping on a lower slope of the mountain. Although we were unfamiliar with the area, we figured the path and campgrounds were popular due to the large amount of Google reviews. We gathered all of our camping goods, prepared our bags, and headed out to the campsite. Despite the short distance, only 45 minutes, the rain intensified as we neared our destination. We weren't fazed by the rain because it was common in this mountainous region, so we continued on our way. Just off the road, at the trailhead, we noticed another car parked on the side as we arrived. Because of the trail's fame, we were surprised that it wasn't more packed, but we were still pleased. While we began to gather our belongings, my girlfriend noticed that the passenger door of the parked car was slightly ajar. We checked all around to see if the owner was present, but I went over to close it because we thought they must have left it open by accident. Even though the entire passenger seat was already wet from the rain, at least it wouldn't become worse. After returning to our car to gather my belongings, we set off on foot down the trail. We remarked on how strange it was that the door was ajar, and how most people would wonder why their vehicle wouldn't lock if the door was ajar. Also, it was obviously a rather costly, relatively new car, which added to the strangeness. Whatever the case may be, we had to start walking faster to make it to the campsite in time to set up our tent because the rain was getting worse. Since much of the trail was uphill, I would estimate that it took us around 2 hours to reach the finish. We arrived to find a tent already pitched in the center of the level field. It was plainly a tent for one person, as it was somewhat tiny. After determining that they were likely seeking protection from the rain, we proceeded to a foresection of the site and pitched our tent there. We ate the food we packed and dried some items inside for an hour before we heard people outside. I had to unzip the front of the tent in order to see what they were saying because the sound of the rain on the canvas was too loud to hear them. 2 men knelt down and stared at us from a few feet away, which made me jump a little. Fortunately, they eventually smiled and introduced themselves. They claimed to have been here for several days and were residing in the central tent. I briefed them on my girlfriend and I, explaining that we were only staying the night. After they left, I glanced at my girlfriend while zipping up our tent. Something was amiss with the whole exchange, and their behavior seemed peculiar. I could tell they were 2 adult males because their tent was far too tiny to accommodate their form-fitting denim and plain t-shirts. It was clear they weren't here for the few days of camping or trekking they had said. We thought it would be prudent to keep a watch on them, so we left the zipper half open. We continued to look for anything out of the ordinary for another hour. To be more precise, we saw absolutely nothing. It seems like they were simply too confined in their tent the entire time. By this point, it was getting pretty dark outside, so we figured it was time to head home and grab our sleeping bags. After rezipping the tent, I collapsed onto the ground next to my lover. Even after lying down, I have no recollection of what happened, so I must have slept quickly. A few hours into my nighttime slumber though, I had to get up and use the restroom. I decided to wear one of my inexpensive plastic rain ponchos just in case I would return to bed drenched because the rain was still coming down. Afterwards, I made my way out of the tent and behind a tree a short distance away. Nevertheless, I perceived voices in the downpour. Their source could not be established, though. I felt a twinge of paranoia and spun around, scanning the room in every way, but nobody was there. Afterwards, I turned my attention to the middle tent and saw that its front zipper was ajar. With the light and rain making it difficult to see, I was certain that no one was inside. My anxiety level grew as I recalled the men assuring me that they would be spending the night in the tent. In a panic, I hurried to my tent, where I roused my partner and filled her in on what had happened. I could see that she was exhausted, yet her anxiety was equal to mine. We both heard voices approaching from behind our tent while we were debating our next move. I felt unsafe sitting in the tent and didn't know what to do. Quickly gather our belongings and be prepared to depart if necessary. I instructed my girlfriend to do the same. Afterwards, I snatched a little pocket knife and hurriedly emerged to survey the forest beyond. Not far from our tent, I could still make out the two guys from before. Both men stared at me emotionlessly, and I'll never forget that moment. Neither of them moved an inch, and they made no expressions whatsoever. It was then that I realized these folks were plotting a terrible crime. Nothing frightened them of me. My girlfriend's glance out of the tent jolted me out of my disbelief, just in time for me to yell at her to go, indicating the path down the mountain. Leaving my luggage in the tent, I trailed after her. As we approached the campsite's perimeter, I glanced back and saw that the two men had not moved an inch. They did nothing to stop us. Instead, they stood by and watched as we fled in terror. For about 10 minutes, we were at a full-out sprint, but then we slowed down and walked swiftly the remainder of the trip. Upon our return to the vehicle, we noticed that the other vehicle had remained parked, but this time the passenger door was ajar. Soon after, I took us to the closest petrol station, where we contacted the authorities, who arrived a short time later to discuss the incident. Things were already terrible, but after a few days we learned a lot more, and it was much worse. ANCUP, doing a search of the area, discovered the vehicle belonged to a senior citizen whose disappearance had just been reported. They recovered the old man's tent from the campground and found out that the thief had taken all of his possessions from the automobile. However, aside from the men's footprints, they were unable to locate the two individuals or any other substantial evidence. Not only was the elderly man not located, but he has also remained missing to this day. Knowing that anything terrible could have happened to us in the blink of an eye made my partner and I feel nauseous. I suppose we'll never know for sure what the two men were planning, but given the circumstances, I think we can all come to a reasonable assumption. However, the memory of those two men standing before me continues to trouble me even now.